There's a journalist who was very active in the Hong Kong protests last year and all the way back to July of 2019, because, of course, the Chinese really shut those protests down last year. But in summer of 2019, the protests were going full steam. And this particular journalist, who's sort of well known, he's won awards for his reporting on what happened in Hong Kong. His name's Michael Yan, and he was personally at the U.S. Capitol on January 6th. And what he had to say was, what we've seen so far in being physically present, Antifa clearly led the attack. That was utterly obvious. They were throwing flashbangs. That's clear. We were right there. There was a lady on a megaphone saying, "Send up the mask, send up the mask." She said it over and over. So on our video and others, that's a clear Hong Kong tactic that I've never seen in any other war and conflict, which is Hong Kongers would constantly say, "Send up water, send up masks, send up shields." So he was right there. He was in the thick of it. And he came back and reported that Antifa was clearly behind the attack on the U.S. Capitol. He said it was utterly obvious. There's so many in-person reports that were filed that day. I've read a number of them. One that I really liked in particular because it was so detailed, and it was actually written up by a guy who's in a position to understand and know all of this. He works at a group called the Center for Security Policy named J. Michael Waller, and I would recommend that you go out there and read his report on what he saw at the U.S. Capitol on January 6th. He titles it Covert Cadre, What I Saw Leading Up to the U.S. Capitol Attack. And really the primary import of what he says, and he goes through a lot of detail. I mean, it's about a 13-page, if you print it out, about a 13-page recitation of what he saw. And he was very careful to only report on what he saw and what he thought while he was there.
You sent that to me, didn't you?
Because I
read that.
Yeah. I mean, it was interesting, wasn't it? Mm-hmm. I mean, what he said, and you got to go out there and read this for yourself. If you want to know what actually happened, if you just want to believe what the media tells you about it, then, obviously don't go read this because this will upset your mind a little bit. But, he was there at the speech ahead of time on the ellipse. Then he walked over to the west front of the Capitol. All during the day, including before the attack, he observed what he said were 4 separate cells or units. He said that there were plainclothes militants, militant, aggressive men in Trump and MAGA gear at a front police line at the base of the temporary presidential inauguration platform. Now, keep in mind that just because they were wearing Trump gear doesn't mean they were actually Trump supporters, and we'll tell you a little bit about that in a following story. But he saw plainclothes militants. He saw what he refers to as agents provocateurs, scattered groups of men exhorting the marchers to gather closely and tightly toward the center of the outside of the Capitol building and prevent them from leaving. He even tells about one incident where a guy was yelling at him, grabbed him by the shoulder, and was trying to tell him, "Don't retreat, go forward," and was kind of screaming in his face. He was there with a friend of his who had an injury, so he was trying to get his friend out of that situation because his friend had a leg injury and would not, potentially fare very well if the crowd started to stampede in one direction or another. So he was trying to get his friend out of there, and he described sort of shaking that agent provocateur's hand off of his shoulder, as he described it. He also said the third category of people that were there are fake Trump protesters. He said a few young men wearing Trump or MAGA hats backwards and who did not fit in with the rest of the crowd in terms of their actions and demeanor, whom I presume to be Antifa or other leftist agitators. And it's interesting that he mentions that the hats being worn backward, because I had heard that ahead of time, that was one of the ways that the Antifa folks were going to be able to identify each other, is that they were going to specifically wear their MAGA hats backwards. And then in a video, I saw one of the guys up at the front when they were first kind of sparring with the Capitol Police at those flimsy little barricades that they had put up. And it's amazing, isn't it, how quickly they've gotten real barricades in place. I mean, it's just unbelievable. Obviously, they know how to do it. But on that day, they just had these thin little metal barricades about 3-4 feet tall that anybody could sort of push aside. I wonder why that was. Anyway, I saw this young man who was sort of sparring, pushing with the Capitol Police on the other side of the barricades. He took his MAGA hat and he turned it around backwards right before he then started to try to throw punches at them, and that was shortly thereafter that they actually overran that particular barricade. So was he a fake Trump protester? Well, I guess we'll never know. But J. Michael Waller says that's some of the group that he saw there. He said there was a fourth group of people there also who he referred to as disciplined, uniformed column of attackers, a column of organized, disciplined men wearing similar but not identical camouflage uniforms and black gear, some with helmets and GoPro cameras, or wearing subdued Punisher skull patches. And he doesn't go into a lot of speculation, but one might sort of speculate on that. That sounds like private military contractors. And he described small groups of them moving about through the crowd, 2 to 3 of them throughout the day. He talked about their facial expressions. I mean, he gets into a lot of detail. It's worth reading. We can't go through and give you the whole picture of everything you had to say here on the show because we just don't have time. But I would say if you're curious about what really happened at the Capitol on January 6th, one of the things you want to do is you want to go out there and you want to read that article, Covert Cadre, What I Saw Leading Up to the U.S. Capitol Attack by J. Michael Waller of the Center for Security Policy. Now, we had other people who identified themselves as members of leftist groups who were involved in fomenting this attack on the Capitol. And again, it wasn't a very serious attack, right? Because, there wasn't that much property that was damaged. I think some windows were smashed and some things were probably stolen from the inside, but nobody went in there and shot the place up or firebombed it or anything like that. Some of what we've seen in some of the more serious Antifa leftist protests in other places. But we've got a couple of examples of folks who live streamed themselves, and we're going to tell you about 2 of them. See, I just saw Roxanne putting on her mask here in the studio, and I'm looking at it. I'm like, well, I haven't been coughing, Roxanne.
No,
you're not scared, are you? So we got 2 folks in particular, though. One we'll tell you about now, and then another one who's really, this is pretty explosive, we'll tell you about on the other side of the break. But the first guy is a guy named Mike Dunn, who's the self-proclaimed leader of the Boogaloo Boys, an anti-government, anti-Trump group. And as rioters roamed the U.S. Capitol, Dunn boasted on Twitter about Boogaloo firearms being employed inside the Capitol. And he said that Boogaloo Boy teams have been activated in Virginia, and we currently have 4 fire teams inside the Capitol and 7 more outside. So you've got radical leftists leading these protests. We'll be right back. Thank you for listening to the Morgan Streetman Show. We hope you enjoyed what you heard, and if you did, please click like and subscribe to help us out. And remember that we recommend that you exercise your brain at least once a week.